the tutor from AthenaStudies, and I'm going to be introducing to y'all the analysis knowledge clip for your writing assignment. So this is the moral limits of the market knowledge clip number 4. So let's get started. The first thing, as always, that I want to introduce to y'all is the word count that I recommend for your analysis. So the analysis is the biggest part of your essay because this is where you're going to be basically tying together all of your arguments that are either going to support or refute your main ideas. So I would recommend about 1,000 to 1,200 words, and it's pretty normal to go on the higher end of that, just so you guys know. But yeah, this is the range that I recommend. So again, as always, I want to give you guys a quick recap of your assignment. You probably have it memorized by now, but again, you're supposed to address the question, to what extent is having the EU passport as a commodity morally legitimate? So that's basically the main topic that you're going to be exploring in your essay. So again, here are just some quick things that you should include in your essay. So, obviously explaining why the research question is relevant, addressing the relevant recent policy, deliberating whether the policy should be adopted by the government, and then obviously answering your research question and formulating a new relevant one for future research. But we're going to go focus specifically on the analysis and what is the goal of the analysis. So the analysis is where you're arguing your points and you're using relevant literature that helps you answer your central question. So this is kind of the opinion part of your writing assignment. And even though it is the part where you're offering your opinion, you still need to have a lot of evidence to support your arguments, because just because you're taking a specific side, you need to support that sufficiently with evidence. And based on the criteria that you identified in your theoretical framework, you can now evaluate and support or refute the max of 2 reasons regarding making EU passports a commodity or not. So just a quick note on this is that you need to discuss which reasons as for why EU passports as a commodity good is or is not morally legitimate, and to what extent. So that's what you're trying to answer. Again, to what extent is having this EU passport as a commodity morally legitimate? So the overall structure of your analysis, I'm going to start with the big picture and then narrow it down a little bit more to what's the logical flow per paragraph. But that's going to be in just a little bit. So first thing you need to address, these are the main things, is the max of 2 reasons why or why not EU passports as a commodity is or is not morally legitimate. So your reason can either be for or against the one that you find, basically. So for reason number 1, it's why having EU passports as a commodity is or is not morally legitimate. So given this reason, you introduce this reason and you describe what the reason is, obviously, and why it has been suggested. So I would recommend when you're looking for your reason, you look through past literature, what has already been suggested as an idea to deal with the EU passport market, potentially, and then take that reason, evaluate it with the criteria you introduced and you defined in your theoretical framework. So again, you need to both support and refute this reason and ultimately conclude whether or not you have sufficient support for or against this reason. So for example, if one of the reasons for an EU passport commodity being morally legitimate, so this one is pro moral legitimate EU passport, if one of the reasons is utilitarianism, then you need to explain why that's a reason and to what extent this reason is valid given your criteria. So if you find that a reason supporting EU passport as a commodity is, again, maximizing the utility, because obviously why would we not do something that's going to be beneficial for us? That's kind of what the view for the utilitarianism is. So in that case, this one is pro having a passport as a commodity. So in this case, you need to explain why that's a reason and to what extent this reason is valid given your criteria. So in this case, for utilitarianism, you can obviously argue pro and say, well, it's not wrong, like having EU passports as a commodity could benefit a lot of people. However, like counter argument. And then in the end, if your stance on the EU passport commodity being morally legitimate is you believe it is, then you can side with this utilitarianism reason And if you do not believe it's morally legitimate, then you can side against this utilitarianism reason. So it really depends on your personal stance or your central question for your essay. And then, of course, if you have a second reason, it's the same basically ideas that you should include as reason one. So again, you need to introduce the second reason for why or why not the EU passport as a commodity is morally legitimate and to what extent it is or is not. Evaluate the reason with your aforementioned criteria in your theoretical framework, and then you can include both evidence supporting and refuting this suggestion. So again, you conclude to what extent this reason is valid. If you're against this reason, then obviously you conclude that it's not valid. And if you do agree, then you can conclude that it's valid to the extent of, given your criteria. So it really, again, just depends on the reasons that you chose and then what your stance is and what side you're arguing in terms of what extent is it morally legitimate. Is it not? Is it? So that's for your second reason if you have two. And it's fine if you only have one. It's totally fine because they just need to be very strong and very backed up by evidence. So in this case, having two reasons is not necessarily better than having one, but also having one is not necessarily better than having two. If you have two reasons and you have a lot of evidence supporting both, that's perfect. And same with just one reason. And a quick note on this is, again, you remember to use your criteria to help you argue whether or not this suggestion is valid. So for example, if your research question was taking the moral legitimate aspect about the EU passports, and one of your criteria for deciding whether this is morally legitimate or not is looking at cultural ethical differences. So if cultural ethical differences was one of your criteria, then you can use that to argue for or against the utilitarian reason that I talked about in the last slide. So let's say that a reason that you found that is pro-EU passport as a commodity is utilitarianism. And one of the criteria that you introduced in your theoretical framework to decide whether or not something is morally legitimate is to evaluate the cultural ethical differences between EU countries. So in this case, you can use that as a measure for whether or not this utility-focused perspective is valid or not. So you use your criteria kind of as like these subtopics within these larger reasons to basically either help you support or refute these reasons for having or not having EU passports as a commodity. So that's basically how your criteria comes into play in your analysis. And now I'm going to go into something a little bit more specific and more detailed. So you have your overall structure of reason one and potentially reason two. And now I'm going to talk about the flow that you're going to have per paragraph or per section. So in reason one, make sure that whenever you're using your criteria to evaluate this reason, you order the criteria in terms of importance. So like I used with the utility example, maybe one of your criteria was cultural ethical differences, and then another one was the length of the naturalization process. Or there's a high demand for EU passports. So which criteria are going to be the most important in answering whether or not utilitarianism, is a valid reason for having or not having EU passports as a commodity? So in this case, which are the most important in answering basically these sub-questions? So maybe naturalization process is a more important criterion for evaluating this reason that you mentioned than the high demand for EU passports. So they can be really anything, but make sure you order it in terms of importance and explain why you put it in that order. And again, make sure you group your paragraphs together under reason one and reason two if you do have a second reason. If you just have one, then you don't really need to worry about that. You just need to make sure that the order of your criteria that you're using is in terms of importance. And then the logical flow per paragraph that I would recommend, because you need to make sure that your getting from point A to point B to point C is very clear and concise. So in this case, in order to have a logical flow, I would first introduce the suggestion that you're going to evaluate. So what is the reason for or against EU passports as a commodity? Then you specify which criteria you're focusing on to evaluate the reason. So for the utilitarianism perspective, maybe you have, I don't know, 3 criteria. So at the beginning of each paragraph, you're going to obviously introduce the criteria that you're going to use to evaluate that reason. And then per criterion, you need to make sure that you introduce evidence supporting and refuting your view on the reason you chose. So per criterion, you need to say the pros of, why this reason is valid given your criteria, and then the cons or the reasons why this reason is not valid. So you need to first find evidence supporting your stance on the issue, and then introduce counter arguments, and then at the very end, after the counter argument, you say why this counter argument is not as important as the evidence supporting your stance, and then you conclude that paragraph with your final statement as to whether or not that the criterion is valid for evaluating the reason, and whether or not you support the reason overall. So that's basically kind of the logical flow per paragraph, basically just starting with your topic and then going into your criterion that you're going to use to evaluate, evidence for, evidence against, and then introducing obviously why the evidence for or pro is better than the con, and then concluding with like a very short conclusion sentence saying, well, overall, like my stance is this based on this evidence, and then move on to the next criterion. So that's basically the logical flow for your paragraph structure and content. And a note on this is that your stance affects whether or not you will agree with the reason. So like I just said, if you don't think a passport market is morally legitimate, then the utilitarianism reason will be one that you don't support. And if you are for or if you are pro, EU passport market, then this is going to be something that you do support. So again, it's highly dependent on what your stance is and what exactly your central question is exploring. So that's another quick note on that. And then now I'm just going to show you an example of my writing assignment. Obviously, the content is completely different because this is taxation. However, I'm just going to show you a quick example of paragraphs that are like the flow of the paragraphs with regards to, evaluating. So for me, I'm evaluating whether or not it's valid or to what extent it's valid for having a short and long-term solution for a digital service tax for the European Union. So one of my criteria that I used to evaluate whether or not this type of tax policy would be successful is the compliance and administration costs. So in my analysis, I introduced the criterion that I'm about to evaluate. Here's all my support for this, saying that, well, based on all this evidence concerning compliance and administration costs, it's good for the tax policy. However, then I introduce a counter argument to this pro argument that I just talked about in the previous paragraph. And then in my counter argument, I just go into why this criterion may not be valid in terms of measuring the success or proving success of the solution. And then at the very end, I just then again argue why this criterion is good versus my counter argument. So I kind of introduce the counter argument and then refute that later and say, well, overall, it's better than worse. So that's an example of one of the sections or one of the criterion that I used personally and how I structured it. So I had my introducing the criterion. This is all my argument for. This is my argument against. And then somewhere down here, I just refute my counter argument, and then conclude with just an overall saying that, okay, this criterion is valid and therefore this tax policy would be whatever, successful or something. So that's just one example of the structure that you can use, but of course yours is going to be slightly different because the content is different and also the requirements for your analysis are slightly different as well. So that's going to conclude this analysis video. Thank you all so much for watching. Comment below if you want one more video to finish up your writing assignment. But yeah, again, check the description box for links to the Moral Limits writing assignment playlist, because I made videos on pretty much all the sections so far, and then also the slides that I used for this video if you would like to access those. But yeah, let me know if you'd want a final video about the conclusion and additional tips. But yeah, thank you again so much for watching. I hope this is helpful, and yeah, good luck on your writing assignments.